Okay, so this afternoon we're going to deliver the first of what will actually be 3 lecture sessions on developing responsive applications in Uniface. This first one is more of an introductory thing. It's going to be presented by Dave Akerman from the UK office, one of our subject matter experts in Uniface. Next month we will do one which will be more focused on the actual development. Okay, so we'll get into a bit more detail. And the following month, so 2 months on from now, we will do one which will cover the deployment side of web application, of responsive applications. The thinking is that we'll probably make that application available in the cloud, so that as we're going live with it, you should be able to access it. So that's quite interesting. We delivered this presentation this morning. What we will do is, it's been slightly tweaked based on some feedback, and we always do this after our first run. The actual presentation will be made available on SlideShare. We will also make a recording available, which we'll put up on YouTube in the coming week or so, after we've gone through some editing and cleaning things up and so forth. So with that, hand over to Dave, and he can run through this.
Today I'm going to take an architectural view of building responsive web applications. I'm going to start high level with the whys, and we're going to drill down into specifics of environment and development considerations. I'll also, after this presentation, show you a demonstration starter application, which we will put up on GitHub maybe a week or so before we check that the installer all works, but that will all be available for you. And I'm going to talk you through that application and show you how it's put together, so demonstrate it and then show you the code behind it. And the plan, as Adrian said, is to extend that in the next lecture and show you some more techniques that you can use in building your own applications. So I'll start with the why. Typically, users often want to bring their own devices, we're finding more and more these days, maybe to expose a small part of their functionality and use the same shared business logic. So for an example, I often use my personal mobile device to record my expenses while I'm working away, so I'm not even in the office. We can maybe make a part of that application available to run on several devices, and obviously that brings the challenge of coping with different screen sizes. In this example, we're looking at one of the demonstration applications I'll show you, and we've got some navigation at the top, some HTML display layout here, showing me some fields you can enter, some labels on the left. And that's all good. We're not using tables to line it up. We're doing CSS to lay it out in a nice way. But when I want to run that on a smaller device, that's not going to quite fit so well. So what we want to see is when we change the screen size, the navigation collapses here into the hamburger menu. You see that the labels move above the fields. Now this is all built with one HTML page that's exactly the same. So we're just building mobile first, and the server-side code is exactly the same for all of this. So it just gives you flexibility to deploy to other devices, but effectively have the same code and no extra maintenance overhead. It may be that you just simply want to improve the user interface and get something that looks nicer than what you've currently got. So also the world is moving more and more to continuous delivery and doing incremental changes to your applications, and centralizing those on a web server, maybe putting in the cloud, is just a smarter way to do that. It reduces your overhead for doing those things. So our solution for rich internet applications is dynamic server pages, or DSPs as I'll call them from now on. This screenshot here is from our demo that we did for the Mobile World Conference in Barcelona last year, and it's a claim handling system. We've got a mobile front end with an Android phone or iPhone interface where you can record a claim, and the handler can come in here and assign someone to deal with the claim, for example. So we've got a little collapsible side menu on there and various charts and nice things that, just show you how it all looks. The key thing about dynamic server pages is it uses the same server-side technology, the same Uniface middleware, and gives you a nice interface to from JavaScript you can use to enhance the front-end experience, and you can call Uniface server-side code, and vice versa. From the server you can call JavaScript code, so you can have a nice integrated solution if you need, and you can choose how much you want to do that. So there's also a very good API in there as part of DSPs. You can even use this externally without using the DSP front end. And it just gives you access to the Uniface data model. This will be, even if you're not a JavaScript developer, I think this will be familiar to most Uniface developers, and it will be fairly easy to learn for a JavaScript developer. An instance is an instance here of a component. They've got entities or tables inside them. They will have multiple occurrences possibly, and they've got fields inside them. If I wanted to set the value of that field, I would just say .setValue and what the value is, and get value to get the value. So as you can see, it's very straightforward, very simple. Uniface Mobile was covered in the last lecture, but the quick summary here is to say that if you build a responsive DSP web app, you can run that straight away on a mobile device. If you want to access native functionality, a hybrid solution lets you build an application where in one line I can get access to your phone contacts or to your location or something like that, anything you want really. So we just give you that ability to extend what you've already built with very little effort and deploy it to your phone. So if you're interested in more detail, have a look at the last lecture, or if that's available, as we'll discuss later. So before you start, much like any project, you're going to think about certain things. What skills do I need? Of course, Uniface. So you still can use a retrieve statement to get all of your data in one command. It's very productive and very easy. But the user interface layer here is HTML. You'll use CSS to lay it out. You may use JavaScript for some instant responses without posting back to the server, such as things like field validation. And years ago when I used to do this, I always found that this was slightly challenging because of browser compatibility. You'd build something in one browser, deploy it on another, and then find suddenly, oh actually that needs a change, it doesn't quite work. So my recommended solution to that is to use some of these toolkits and frameworks out there to help you. Now the power of Uniface here is that we use totally pure standard HTML. We don't dictate to you what your interface must look like because we know that people out there have their own standards and ways that they want to work. So what we do is we let you just create your HTML the way you want using the standards that you want to use, and typically these frameworks like Bootstrap, Polymer, Chocolate Chip UI, they're all frameworks for just CSS layout, and it just saves you having to build it yourself. Typically they support a grid system for laying things out, maybe 12 columns, so that you can get that kind of resizing, and you can say on a smaller device lay it out slightly differently based on the screen size. You used to build applications a lot using images, but what happens if you want to actually allow your customers to actually modify that and get their own look and feel? Again, it's quite useful to use things like font libraries because they contain the images in lots of different sizes, and if I want to change the colors, I can just change the CSS and automatic color change. No need to create multiple images that also, because they're loaded as separate files, take longer. And jQuery just and frameworks like that simply allow you to do more with less JavaScript code. So you might as well use them to help you if you're writing some client-server code. We don't dictate any of that, we just integrate nicely with them. So project considerations, this should all really be familiar to all of you. You know, how do you start any project? Well, you look at what your requirements are and you plan and build something to meet those requirements. That's the key thing. And often your requirements will drive what you actually do. This is why it's always a little bit different for every customer in my experience. So the key thing I would say here is having done that, plan, well, what can you do with your existing application? Maybe you've already got something that you can expose those services that you've already built. You can reuse them. Make sure you've got the right skills and people. And I would strongly suggest you do a proof of concept, because if you're doing anything new, irrespective of the technology, you will want to learn lessons of what are our challenges and how do we actually meet them. If you do that, you take a real scenario. Obviously it's going to be a little bit slower at first where you work out what you're doing, but then at the end of the day you can build a little factory where you can get very productive and you can re-estimate and actually give accurate plans to your management about the effort involved. So, I strongly recommend that. Don't just start developers working on things until you've thought a little bit about the architecture. Uniface gives you a lot, but a little bit of thought up front goes a long way. So once you've done that, you can then literally, just you can reuse all your existing business logic, reuse some of your user interface logic, and you can just start building things. Now, the key thing I'd like to stress is that if you're putting things on the web, there is no getting away from the fact that there are some non-functional requirements you need to think about. This again applies to any technology, but you will be thinking about things like, if I've got a desktop app, do I want to make the user interface look familiar and simple for them? I've seen cases where that's been done. Or do we want to take this opportunity to build a new user interface, maybe just improve usability, improve the look and feel? Scalability and fault tolerance probably won't be an issue if you've got 50 concurrent users accessing things on the server at the same time, and that would translate to more concurrent users. But if you've got to deal with thousands of users, then you're starting thinking about security and scalability. That's all very easy to do, and you can use industry standard components for it, a lot of which are free, and I will be talking more about that in the third lecture about deployment, so I won't go into much detail there. Security is a big topic. If you're going to make things available in a web browser, you've got to be aware that knowledgeable users may try and actually misuse your application in ways you didn't intend. So you need to validate everything that's coming in from the web browser and just make sure that, for example, somebody can't access a page unless they've logged in, or that you're not putting things on the screen that they can amend. So just think about that. And my other suggestion would be that if you have SLA targets and performance is important to you, think about that at the start. Build something into your architecture and bear that in mind. Small things like, the web is stateless, you're saving data, getting it back, minimizing that will improve your performance. So you need to think about that. And just in your proof of concept, build something that does it. So moving on, I'm going to delve a little bit more into the detail now. Now, these slides actually show you some of the details about the environment. What I'll show you here is the architecture diagram shows you that you've just got a browser talking to a web server. The web server is actually optional. You probably will only really need to use it in a large scalable scenario. You can use your web request dispatcher here, Tomcat, which is the thing that passes the requests for dynamic content through to Uniface. It can also serve static content, and the performance difference is not so great as it used to be these days. So for development, that's all I use. So that is just literally a jar file that you can store in anything, be it WebSphere, JBoss, whatever you want, and that just talks to the Uniface middleware, which runs your uRouter server. If you're an existing Uniface user, you'll already be using this for application server or polyserver data access functionality, so there's nothing new for you here. Now, if you've got multiple applications, typically if it's a desktop application you have multiple shortcuts. For a web application, that doesn't really work so well. You obviously have to do a different approach, and you'll typically just have a modified URL that points at what you actually want to do. So in this example, I've got a context, which is the Tomcat word for virtual directory, pointing to my production environment, and then it's talking to the web request dispatcher, that's what WRD means, and running a component. I can rename those to anything I want. So in the second example here, I've got another application. It might actually just be a different version of my application, and I've set up a servlet for test and a different one for production and a different one for development. So you can do it how you want. The key thing is that each URL will eventually map to a Uniface configuration. Now, the slides will be available, and they show you all of this. There's a config file that points to the physical file. I'll actually show you this in my environment, so quickly go through these. And there's a config file inside there that points to the Uniface definition. So what I will do is actually show you that in my environment. So here's my virtual machine coming up, bear with me. Okay, so I've got a project folder here. I've called it it's my D drive, it's projects, Uniface. I'm using 9.7 for this one, but it will easily import into 10. And it's called WebStart. And here's my development environment with my shortcut and all my things in there. I've actually got a web subfolder inside it that contains all my static content, my JavaScript and my images and so on. Now, all I've done in my Uniface environment, when we installed it here, we have got a number of things in here. Uniface comes with a Tomcat installation. You can use the standard one of your own. I'm just talking about this because you might want to set up your own custom one. And here I've just created a context or a virtual directory called webstart.xml. So that gives me the virtual directory. And if we look inside that, we'll open that in Notepad++, we'll see here, and you can see that, it just points to that physical directory. Very straightforward. Because we've got a customized version, you just restart the service if you the Tomcat service if you make a change. Now, if we look at that folder, so go back into it, I'll just copy that out. And open that up. We'll see that as well as our static content, we've got a hidden folder called WebInfear, and it contains a file in there called webxml. That's the configuration file that tells Tomcat how to configure with to connect to Uniface. So we've got a servlet name here, WRD, Web Request Dispatcher, and this middleware parameter here shows me what server to connect to, typically the same one, what port we've installed on, and the end bit here tells me the configuration name that we're connecting to. That's the Uniface configuration name for my application server, effectively. That is pretty much it. The rest of it is just in the router assignment file in Uniface, where we can specify, we've got a default one that came with Uniface with a debugger set up automatically. We just created another one. Here our WebStart that I've just included in the other file that points to my new folder and uses a relative path to talk to get my configuration files, and that's it. It's as simple as that. So, coming back to my presentation, hold on, sorry, we'll quickly shut it down, here we go. So, the other thing you need to be aware of is the fact that Uniface provides some of its own functionality via a JavaScript file, like for example Uniface.js that does all the data synchronization, and that needs to be available. So you've got two choices. You can either tell Uniface in the assignment file where that's deployed to. This is this Uniface runtime base URL, Uniface common. Or I could create another virtual directory. The pound or hash sign at the bottom here is just another virtual directory inside WebStart. And I just tell it where that physically lives and point it at the same Uniface location. And that's it. That's all available. Why would you do this? Because if you don't, then if you copy it to your web application, then when you patch Uniface, you're going to have to duplicate that. So by doing this, you're saving yourself the trouble. Okay, so moving on. Development. Obviously, because we're building for the web, there's going to be certain elements that might be slightly different. You will still possibly use, well, very likely to use your same navigation logic in terms of what options have I got as a user, what rights have I got, what can I see, but you just might implement it slightly differently. It'll be some HTML that allows you to maybe collapse a menu and hide a menu and so on. So these are all, to me, elements of your architecture that you'll do once. And you'll just build your application to use. The way you handle tabs might be different. So for example, on a desktop application, you might store a record but not commit it until they've finished. But on a stateless web application, that means that the next user could come in and use the same server and end up committing your changes. So instead what you would do, Uniface actually persists all this data in the DOM on the web browser. You can actually just take a different approach, build one page, hide the bits you don't want, allow them to switch between it, submit it all as one thing. Again, we'll see more of this in the next presentation. You want to think about modality and overlays. By that I mean we've got a form popping up on top of another. In a web application, it's going to get confusing if you do too many of those. So you just think about, how do I do that? We'll show you in the next lecture. And then just how are we going to do it in our application here? We've talked a bit about icons. Business logic, you'll typically use your services and do it more like a batch approach, where you'll just say, call this, get a list of errors back, handle them. Validation should always be done on the server, because remember, users can tamper with things on a web browser. But if you want to actually do some validation as people type things, you can do that in JavaScript, and we provide ways to do this either in Uniface code or JavaScript as you prefer. Error handling and messaging will typically be a part of your application architecture. You'll build a standard way of doing it and reuse it. So again, I'll show you that. And we talked about the responsiveness. You just build your HTML to work for that. And just remember, a reminder to think about accessibility. So again, there are various standards for this. I won't go into it, but just be aware of it. So the key thing to note with dynamic server pages is that it's very similar Uniface code, but a page will not be displayed typically until you load it into a container. So in this example, I've got a navigation page that has all the navigation controls on the top, and inside it I've got another container that I'm loading the page I want to display in. So when I click on another navigation link, I would be just changing the page that I load inside that container. And we can expand that for your complete application to something a little bit more sophisticated. If you think about the flow of a standard application, it always has a login form typically. So the first thing I would request is my main DSP, and that's just got a container in it. We're not actually displaying anything yet. The first thing you will do in the code was actually load the login form into the container. The login form will have a username and password, buttons and so on, entry fields, and we're using another container to show messages. So if you make an error, we don't want to duplicate all of that logic, so we'll write another component to handle it. And if you've got an error, we'll just display it by just loading in the error message component and activating an operation on it. Once you've actually logged in, we'll tell the main one now that you need to load in a navigation form. So just simply by saying my content field, which is container is nav, I'm loading the nav component in. Then we've actually got subcontainers in there, because obviously as you move through the navigation you want to load different pages to display. But you can see here that we're reusing our existing message component. So once that's loaded, you'll just load a page into that container and you'll see the page that you're running. I'll show you this in a bit. Other considerations. As I've said, it's HTML and CSS. So you just build that. We help you a bit with that in generating that HTML and CSS, and in Uniface 10 that's even easier because you've got snippets and modeling so that you can actually create the standard code that you want to inherit to save you time doing this manually every time. I've talked a bit about long transactions and about the fact that you need to persist data and save it together. I talked about client-side code. Validation, as I said, can be Uniface code or JavaScript code. The same goes for a handling. You're very want to think about the fact that it's stateless and try and reduce the amount of variables that you're trying to save between each request. We don't have a hit list on the web, but that's fine. We've got data paging. So again, that will be shown in the next lecture. And think about things like authentication. So as I said before, if you go to a web page but you haven't logged in, you want to throw the user out. It's as simple as that. And just think about what you're displaying to the user. Can it be tampered with? And it really comes down to that. If you're not sure about those things, there are plenty of other lectures and examples, and there's a lot in the Uniface help with all of this. So, don't be afraid to ask. There's a lot of resources to help you with this. Once you've built them, you'll probably try and automate this and make it very productive to build things. So you'll build templates, you'll build libraries and snippets that you can reuse when you're building this again and again. If you're coming from a desktop application, you just need to mainly be aware that there are some differences. There's some commands which simply won't work on a web application because they don't make sense. So there are alternative approaches for all of these. I typically just use the pre-compiler to say, well, what kind of a form am I in? Is it a DSP? Is it a client-server desktop app? And I do slightly different behavior in those cases. You want to think about the things about, like on the web, you typically use optimistic locking rather than cautious locking. And just think about, you know, how you validate and how you do things. So I'll show you that going forward. Application architecture then, this to me is the thing you build that supports your common requirements of your application. It's going to be driven by the requirements of what you need to do. So there will be common bits that you can take that pretty much everyone does. And one of the ideas I had with this starter application was to give you exactly some of those techniques in development. There's also other frameworks up there. Have a look on our GitHub site. My advice is to take the things you want out of it rather than trying to build things using all the features at the start. You'll find it much easier to control what you're doing it that way. But typical things in the user interface is, as I said, navigation, modality, so popping up a form on top of the form you're working on, graying out what's in the background, preventing them from doing other things while you deal with a dialogue, handling errors and messages, dealing with tabs. So for example, you could preload all your tabs with all of the data in there and make it very quick to switch between them. Or if you think they're not commonly used, you could maybe load them on demand, and that will improve your performance. So there's just little things like that. If you're doing it again and again, put it in your architecture, do it once, and then don't reinvent the wheel every time you build something. It's just there to support you. Some of the common things like checking that you're authenticated before you display a page, or a common one that I do, and I'll show you, is if I'm working with an external web designer, I don't want to have all my HTML layout in the Uniface IDE. It's really nice when I'm building things myself, but if I'm working with someone else, I just want to be able to give them a file. They can maybe change it and give them back to me. I can customize the code to do it very quickly and easily. So I might make changes, and I'll show you those sorts of changes. And once you've done it, you can basically build yourself component templates, or what we call model components in Uniface 10, that allow you to do these things even quicker. If you've got a standard list form or a maintenance form, the same strength that we've always had in Uniface Desktop. So that pretty much wraps it up for the presentation for now. There are various resources online to help you. Remember, you've got the Uniface Help has a lot of tutorials, and those are actually recorded on YouTube. So you can watch those, and I recommend if you're new to Uniface DSPs, have a look at the tutorials first before you start doing some of these things. We provide training either online or in classrooms. Uniface Info has a lot of useful things on it, samples, forums, blogs. You can ask questions, and indeed we encourage you, if you've got issues or questions relating to this, feel free to actually put them on Uniface Info. We monitor those forums and often respond to those things. So, and you get other people then giving their input, which is always valuable. We also have a number of tools and frameworks available on our GitHub site. So if you haven't been there to have a look at that, feel free to do so. The code for this sample I'm going to show you is already up there. I will be doing some work in the next week just to kind of help you with the installation of that. So not everything you find you need to run it will be there at the moment. And keep an eye on that, that will change soon.